Not everybody, you see, would work the sign gifts. Everybody in the Old Testament passage now, two of them in fact, that are keys to understanding the purpose of tongues. What two passages would they? Okay, Deuteronomy 28, yes, and the other one would be Isaiah 28. So if you can remember the number 28, why, hey, you're pretty good. Now, after listening to me for a couple of days, you probably think that if you were to go to my church, you'd probably see something like this in the church. Or if somebody did happen to raise their hands or do something in the church, somebody might say, hey, quit, call 911, but, oh, I don't know. Maybe it's not quite that bad. But I'd like to put some of these things together today, if I could. Because some of the things you might be saying is well, what is going on? What is going on? Well, let me give you a series of things that I would just say. All right? What is going on? Here's the first thing I would say as to what is going on. Number one, I would say this, and I've already told you this. It's impossible to explain everybody's experience. It's impossible to explain everybody's experience. And I know that's difficult because you see something on television or you hear something or you see something taking place. You remember my little story about the fellow who says, well, I think this believer's demon possessed, and then he told me that story. Well, if it hadn't been for the one student overhearing it and then telling me what was behind it, why, I would have never explained that till the day I died. So that's why I want to say this. It's impossible to explain everybody's experience. Let me give you an example of this. There was a faith healer some time back called Catherine Kuhlman. Have you ever heard of her? Yeah, she was a faith healer and so forth. There's a book that has been written. It's been written by a doctor in search of miracles. The title of it, his name is Nolan. And one of the problems that he had is that as people came to him, he said, I'm sorry, there's no help for you. And I can appreciate that. My wife was diagnosed with MS over 12 years ago. And I think this has been our experience when she has gone to most doctors. Most doctors, you see, have said, well, we don't know what you have. And this book really helped me when I finally read it because what he said is when we don't know the answer or when we know we don't have a cure, it is a lot easier to say, we don't know what you have. Rather than look you right in the eye and say, look, hey, there is no real cure to this. We could maybe suggest a couple of things that might help, but ultimately, there is no cure. So it was a great help to me. And also, I think he was doing an honest attempt to try to say, look, if indeed these people are helping where I can't, he says, then what I want to do is be able to refer them to people. So he wrote a whole book on it. It's an interesting book if you ever get a chance to read it. Here's one case that he developed. It's Mrs. Helen Sullivan, 50-year-old woman with cancer of the stomach that had spread to her liver and the vertebrae in her back. At Catherine Kuhlman's suggestion, Mrs. Sullivan had taken off her back brace and run back and forth across the stage several times. 2 months after the miracle service, this is what the author who was writing the book said, I talked to Mrs. Sullivan. She was confined to her bed, which had been moved into her living room. Then, this is a quote from this woman. She said, I knew about Catherine Kuhlman from watching her television show. And when I read that she was coming to Minneapolis, I got pretty excited. My husband kept telling me not to get my hopes too high, but when you're awfully sick and someone tells you that you may be cured, it's impossible not to get excited. At the service, as soon as she said someone with cancer is being cured, I knew she meant me. Went right up on the stage, and when she asked me about the brace, I just took it right off. Though I hadn't had it off for over 4 months. While I was up on that stage, bending over, touching my toes, running up and down, I felt just wonderful. I was sure I was cured. Now, this is where you usually stop watching. In other words, the person supposedly is cured, you go on and you see somebody else. Now, this is what she says. The next morning, I woke up with a horrible pain in my back. Doctor put me in the hospital, got some x-rays, showed one of my vertebrae had collapsed. He said it was probably from the bending and the running I had done. I stayed in the hospital in traction for a week. When I went home, I was back in my brace. Since then, I've gotten a lot weaker. I can't make it upstairs anymore. That's why we have the bed down here. And then he went on to say, Mrs. Sullivan died of cancer 4 months after she had been cured at Catherine Kuhlman's miracle service. And so he has case after case after case. And what I'm trying to say is you can't explain everybody's experience, because all you do is you see what apparently you see on TV, and you don't see what happened 4 months later to the same people possibly who were on the stage. So that's just one of the things I would say. We can't follow up on all cases. We don't know all the explanations. There are just a lot of things going on. I would just say this: you can't explain everybody's experience. Do you remember hearing Jim Jones? Remember that little Jim Jones? He took a bunch of people, from his church, took them down to Guyana, and eventually panicked, and they all drank poison and killed the whole group. I've got about probably a 20 to 30 minute video. I'll show you that tomorrow on Jim Jones. It's really a sickening thing. There's a book entitled Deceived, and it basically points out how people get into all of this stuff. And so I'll just read a couple of pages if I could. Al Mills remembers Jones calling out his name from the platform during the second service they attended. He called us up and said, I see a little red wagon, and it says such and such on the side of it. There's something defecting in the steering mechanism of the wagon, and you'd better check it out in a hurry. Went on to tell about a French cookbook that he had in the house. And remember something about also the dog. He said, well, after the service, we went right home, and we checked out his prophecies. And sure enough, there was something wrong with the wagon and the dog, yes. And he went out, and near the kitchen window, you see, was his cookbook. He said, we were impressed. It wasn't until years later we found out that when we gave our name and address at the front door of the temple, his people were dispatched to our house to survey it, talk to neighbors, rummage through the garbage cans, and look in our windows for clues to information about us. You see, you could go to something like that and say, well, how do you explain this? I mean, he told us about our dog and the problem it had. You say, wow, the guy must be a prophet. We should follow him. You see, well, see, this is stuff you don't know. Goes on to say in the book, staff members became extremely skilled at feigning illnesses and death, only to be healed or raised from the dead by their boss or co-conspirator. So, it's just on and on with all kinds of stuff, that seemingly, all of this took place. You say, well, I'll tell you this. We know we will never be deceived, especially being in your class, Christian Theology, because you have taught us the Word, you have taught us look. You look to the Bible first. That's how you develop your theology, not to your experience. By the way, the second highest man in the People's Church, Tim Stone, tomorrow on that TV, he will give you his testimony. He will talk about how he was taken in, how he and his wife joined this, how his son was killed, he was right in the middle of the whole thing. Let me read you what he says in this book. He says, I was raised in a Christian home. My parents were fundamentalists, members of the General Association of Regular Baptists. That is probably the most conservative, anti-charismatic group in the whole country. He was raised in it, and he ends up in Jim Jones. I think that's probably a good title of the book, Deceived. It's easy to be deceived. And I think it's easy to be deceived, you see, when we're caught up in the experience and not caught up, you see, into the Scriptures. That's why I think we need to be good students. Most people don't exegete the Bible, they exegete their experience. And I know that to be true. You say, man, I went to camp and I had this glorious experience. That's where I dedicated my life. And, prior to that time, I wasn't dedicated. I was only saved. So you get saved over here and you have this one-time dedication over here. Find me a verse, friends, that says there's a one-time dedication in the Bible. You see, I can't find it. Now, I've heard in our circles us talk about it ever since, I can remember hearing anything. But I can't find a verse. Well, Romans 12, verse 1 and 2, present yourselves a living sacrifice. We'll read it. What does it say? What kind of a sacrifice? A living sacrifice. It's talking about our whole life here. It's not talking about what you do at camp. You see? You say, I went to camp, somebody quoted the verse, something happened that night, boom, I figured that's what the verse said. I don't see that in the verse. He's talking about our whole life, you see, being placed upon the altar. All right? So I don't see a one-time act there. It's interesting how we come up, you see, with our theology. So all I'm trying to say is, if you look to experience and then try to find a verse, you see, to put in there, then we can be deceived. He was deceived. You say, well, he should have gone to a Christian college. He did. I just want to tell you which one it was. All right? Because it'd be a put down of the school. But he went to a Christian college. It can happen, you see, in our college too. So I say we have to be very, very careful. So here's the first thing I'd say. It's impossible to explain everybody's experience. Don't build your theology as a result on saying, well then, how do you explain it? Here's the second thing I would say. I think experiences need to be seen in light of Scripture. Experiences need to be seen in light of Scripture, not vice versa. Not vice versa. And the reason I say that is because a lot of people have experiences that, are contradictory, for instance. The Bible doesn't contradict itself. And also, people's experiences are just plain baseless. I mean, they're contradictory. If you're going to go to experience, who are you going to follow? Mary Baker Eddy? Sister McPherson? I mean, who, So there's so many people out there saying, I've had this experience. Follow me. I said, whose experience are you going to follow? They're all contradictory. Follow the Scriptures. And then some of them are really baseless. Listen to this one. I don't know if you ever heard, years ago, they used to claim that in Indonesia, when the gospel went out, there were tremendous miracles. I don't know if you ever heard about those. The great Indonesian revivals, people being raised from the dead. Well, one of the great converts wrote a book entitled Like a Mighty Wind. And they asked him, do you think that those experiences, in other words, that kind of revival can be seen in the United States? This is what he said. He said, yes. Yes. He said, if you will take out that small computer, which is your brain, put it in a little box, and shoot it to the moon, and then let God use your heart, yes, you'll see the same things happening here. But I said, that's baseless. Whoever said take your brain out, you see, and send it to the moon, and then just let God use your heart, Set your mind on things above, all right? Not just your emotions, not just your feelings. Don't read into what you want to happen, you see, into your Christian experience, and think that's Christianity. If that's the case, you'll see anything. You'll see all kinds of things. Remember years ago, there was a gal around, Jimmy Carter's sister. Ruth Carter Stapleton was her name. She was interviewed by Tom Snyder. And so I tried to make a copy of this. Tom Snyder said, Ruth, much has been said during the political campaigns about what some members of your family refer to as a profound religious experience. And we've heard that term quite a bit. What is a profound religious experience? And this is what Jimmy Carter's sister said. She said, well, I think it's any time anyone comes into a new awareness. Or an awareness of a new dimension of their life other than just body and mind. The intellect, something else besides the intellect. And this can happen in an experience that doesn't even seem to be real religious. I had an interview the other day with a reporter, and he was doing a paper on what it means to be born again or have a religious awareness. As I was trying to share with him, he's very intellectual, and I was trying to share to him what it meant to a Baptist, a Southern Baptist. And then I tried to share what it meant to a Roman Catholic. And then I said, you know, it could mean the same thing to an atheist. But he wouldn't call it the same. And he says, well, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, a person who has always thought of himself as just two dimensions, intellect and body. And maybe he's listening to good music all of a sudden, or maybe poetry, great poetry, and all of a sudden he moves into an awareness or a new dimension he's never experienced before. And then he knows he returned. He knows something, but he doesn't know what he knows. And I said, that's the religious experience. And he jumped up off the chair and he said, my God, I've been born again. And in that moment, he came into the awareness that he had an awareness. And I say, friends, this is baseless. No wonder we have 22% of the Mormon population today running around saying they're born again. Because what does it mean to be born again today in our culture? It means very little. Very little. To these people it means this, to these people it means this. And if to some of these people they come up and say, guess what, I've been born again, you see. And they've had a baseless experience, it doesn't mean that they have been born again. So that's why I'm saying let's not look at people's experience first. In fact, one of the well-known converts of Ruth Carter Stapleton was a guy named Larry Flint. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of Larry Flint, but he puts out a magazine called Hustler. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Hustler magazine, but kind of a pornographic thing, I believe. So this is what he said. If you ask me, he says, I am a born-again Christian. Ruth Carter even baptized him, okay? But, he says, I'm going to continue publishing pornography, and anybody who doesn't like it can go kiss a rope. Pornography, he says, is not sinful. In fact, future issues in the magazine will feature photos of Christ and portray sexual scenes from the Bible. Oh, praise the Lord for that. All right? I've been making fun of him for years. All of a sudden, you know what happened? One day he came out and said, hey, guess what? I'm not born again. That was all a hoax. I told you. All right? I mean, you can't have a baseless experience and be born again. So, here's the third thing I'd say. Third thing I'd say about all these experiences, I'd say many of these experiences are probably learned, possibly psychological. And I'd also say many of them are false too. False phone. Okay? You say, well, what about tongues? Man, that seems to be so miraculous. I mean, coming in this unknown language that we have never spoken before. In a book put out by the Charismatic Movement entitled Those Controversial Books, on page 88, they say, you can speak in tongues if you simply know the mechanics. You, of course, got to open your mouth. You need to loosen your tongue muscle with certain exercises. You need to repeat a string of lies to produce the right sound. Of course, in the background, some kind of emotional song, will help. He goes on to say there is an environment which is conducive to the discovering of the gift of tongues. And the gift can be taught and instructed as one would instruct in counseling and evangelism. And all I'm trying to say is that has been written, you see, by somebody who says, look, I believe that tongues is a legitimate gift. So maybe it's not so supernatural as it is just something that is learned. So that is something that is said, you see, within the movement. I have several, you can do it and whatever. So that's why I say, I think some of these things can be learned. Again, I don't know if I can explain everybody's experience. I don't even know if I want to try. Psychologically, I don't understand that whole realm. I do know this, that psychologically, if you get this thing thinking right up here, I think it can help your physical well-being. In fact, all kinds of studies have come out to say people with hope-filled brains, live better lives. In fact, right here in the city of Salem one time, the doctors got together with all the preachers and said, look, we'd like to see how the two of us could kind of blend our efforts. And it was kind of interesting as they were talking, a fellow got up, a doctor, and he said, I had a cancer patient come into my office. He had cancer, I diagnosed him as such. But he said, I decided to try something. I said, yes, you do have cancer, but we can cure it. We can cure it. We have a new technique called Corban that we will give you. And we'll just shoot it into your veins, and it'll help. So he did that. He just shot water into them. And then he came back for a checkup a few months later, and he says, hey, the cancer was gone. However, this guy, he happened to be a pilot for a major airline, was reading an article one day, and he came to this conclusion that, hey, that doesn't help. So he went back to his doctor and said, no. Hey, I was reading this article, and they said that's not going to work. And so they checked him, and sure enough, he had cancer again. He said, no, it will work. It will work. You just need a double dosage of it. So he gave him a double dosage of it, came back a few months later, and there was no cancer in it. Later on, though, he came back in, and he says, look, I want to tell you, I don't believe this. And the doctor checked him for cancer, and he had it again. And what he was trying to say is I think, maybe the mind is more powerful than we think, and can produce all kinds of, things. In that one article that's in your notes, and I hope that you read that article, it's written, you see, by somebody who's a medical doctor, who's watched people be healed. And, when he says, look, the healing rate of the saved and unsaved is basically the same in the hospital, and some of the other things. I remember one that he told, in fact, I told it in a church one time. I said, I've heard of, women thinking that they were pregnant. Did some of you remember reading that? The menstrual cycle stops, and the breasts change the hormones, and, you get fatter, and you put on weight, and, everything takes place except for one thing. The fetus is not there. Morning sickness, whatever, I told this in the church. A woman came up to me and she says, you were talking about my daughter, weren't you? I said, what? Yeah, that's exactly what happened to my daughter. I have two daughters. One got pregnant and the other one really wanted to get pregnant, and they both went through the symptoms exactly the same. Same things took place. Weight, everything, whatever. The only difference is one had a baby and the other one didn't have a baby. Wow. So I'm saying, this mine. This mine. And then I also have to say that I think, frankly, there's a lot of phony stuff going on. Okay? Just a lot of phony stuff. And I'll try to show you some of that on video in the next couple of days, because people are skilled in trying to be phony. Here's Oral Roberts. He has a little magazine called The Abundant Life. I was interested in reading Richard Roberts' first wife's book one time. And she said, we would often return back to the campus and then read about, our great campaigns that we were in. And she said the stories about the crusade were greatly exaggerated, he said, as to what had happened. Now, let me tell you something. It's just not these kinds of people that exaggerate. Guess what? We all exaggerate. I had a president of one of our schools get up in chapel one day and tell this tremendous story. And I leaned over to one of his professors who was with him that day, and I said, wow, That must have been quite an experience that you had when you were with him. And he leaned over to me and he said, you know, I've heard that story several times now, and it gets better every time. And so, you know, we all have a tendency to exaggerate. Maybe preachers, that's just natural for them to exaggerate. You see a common story. So that's the problem. In fact, they went on to say this about this magazine. Among ourselves, we began calling the magazine The Abundant Lie. Not The Abundant Life. The Abundant Lie. Andre Cole has written a book, From Illusion to Reality. He says several doctors actually have endorsed these psychic healings while recognizing the absurdity of the operations. Do you know what I'm talking about? You go over to the Philippines, these psychic healers come out and they work over the body, you know, and they're pulling out cancer all over the place, and there's blood and, you know, and whatever. And really all they do is get parts of chickens, you know, and they put them there in their hands, and, you know, they go over the body and they're pulling all this out. One day they caught them on camera, and the camera was quicker than the eye, and they put them right out of business. But, you know, they use this to say, hey, we're pulling cancer out, and then they look at the body and there'd be blood all over the body, and then they wipe off the blood. There's not even any incision mark. But people are paying good money to run to the Philippines. He says this, these doctors are taken in because they are not trained in the field of deception. Frankly, I think what seminaries need to do today, if they're going to train people for the ministry, is give them a good class in magic. And I got some good videos on that. I'll show those to you when we come to the whole area of demonic activity. And so many of them just show how these tricks can be done. So I want you to see that. Well, those are three conclusions that I would draw. I think that there's just a lot of, there's just a lot of things going on, and I think those are the three best things that maybe I could discuss with you. Any question about anything that I have said? All right? You might say, well, I got this experience. Well, see, I always go back to number one. I can't explain everybody's experience. All right? Also, let's look at it in light of the Word. And I think there are other explanations, whatever they are, psychological, learned, or whatever. Now, I want to be kind and sensitive to these people. I want you to understand this. I don't think people who speak in tongues are crazy. I want you to know that. I don't think they're demonic either. I think in many respects it's a culture. It's a culture that we're in. It's a learned experience. I think they're exegeting their experience. In fact, Gordon Fee, who was president at Gordon Conway, a president of one of the leading evangelical schools in our country, and in the Assemblies of God's Church, actually said, I think this idea of the second experience, they call it the baptism of the Holy Spirit, we call it dedication, but they call it baptism of the Spirit. He says, hey, it's an exegeting of their experience. You do not find it in Scripture. In fact, that's where I picked up this idea, exegeting of their experience. I got it from an Assembly of God's person who was, you see, speaking about his own growth. So I want to be fair, I want to be kind, but at the same time, I think that's probably where it's at. They have some struggles. Hey, all of us have some struggles in some of these areas. Yeah.
I was just wondering what faith plays into all of this, as far as healing today and being practical, but having faith.
Where does faith play into this? Well, first of all, let's define faith. What is faith? I say faith is believing what God has said. Okay? Stop. If I believe that somebody's going to give me $1 million today, is that faith? No, not unless God said somebody's going to give me $1 million today. Okay? So a lot of people have faith in faith. All right? But it is not faith in what God has said. Faith doesn't have any benefit unless it rests in a proper object. Okay? Do you believe on this front row that I will give you this dollar. The second row, do you believe I will give you this dollar? I'm not giving it to you. I'm giving it to him. All right? Now, what value is that faith? You see, it's worthless. You see. It's got to rest in a proper object. He can believe all he wants that I'm going to give him this money. I am not. All right? It's just like somebody says, I believe I'm going to heaven. You do? Well, why? Because I'm a good person. That is worthless. Worthless faith. Your faith only gets its value because of the object in which it rests. If God says, look, you're going to heaven because you trust me, then, hey, that's its value. So that's the first thing I would say. The other thing I would say is this. I really think it is the most cruel thing I have ever seen to go to somebody who is not healed and who has a problem and say your problem is a lack of faith. I think that is one of the most cruel things I have ever seen. Okay? I think certainly that is a misunderstanding of Scripture. If you look at a lot of people who were healed in the Scriptures, they didn't have any faith at all. Especially the people who were dead. All right? So, I don't know that faith is a prerequisite to it always taking place. And just to have a belief, you see, I think can be a cruel thing when in fact God has said, look, those people, you see, will remain in this condition and that is my will. You see. I'll give you an example of this. The paper some time back, there was an article entitled this. Parents expect resurrection of boy dead in faith healing. Okay? It's really a sick article. It goes on to say about how a preacher came in to town, cured an 11-year-old boy, Wesley, of his problem of being a diabetic. And so what they decided to do is they said, well, as long as he's been healed, let's take away his medicine. All right? The next morning, they decided that what they were going to do is give him his medicine, and all of a sudden they realized, oh no, we have to get rid of the medicine right out of the house, you see. To give him the medicine would be, you know, an example of no faith. They have to have faith in this thing. So they, of course, decided to get rid of the medicine. They even made a movie on this. I don't know if any of you ever saw this. But eventually the kid died. And of course, then the people, well, they thought he was going to be raised from the dead. You know, they sat around for a number of days. You know, now you say they really believed. Boy, they did believe. I mean, to sit around, even on the funeral, it was quite a thing. They thought in the middle of the funeral the kid was going to come up right out of the coffin, you know. And they really believed this. And they believed it after he was put in the ground. And I'm saying, you talk about people who had faith, but I say it was cruel. It was cruel. I understand why they wrote the book later on. We let our son die. I say that's not faith, that's foolishness. Okay? So, I had a mother call me one time in my church. She said, hey, you don't know me. And I said, yeah. Well, you know my son. He goes to your church. Oh, yeah, I do. He's married. He's a diabetic. He went to a healing service here in the city of Salem just last Thursday night. He decided to quit taking his insulin. Oh, could you help him? He needs to get on that insulin. He's going to be in a world of hurt. I said, well, let me talk to the doctor. Could I talk to his doctor first before I talk to him? So she gave me the name of the doctor. I called the doctor and I said, look, doctor, I said, I don't want to panic, all right? But here's the situation. The doctor told me this. He said, preacher, if you ever wanted to panic in your life, now is the time, all right? So I called him up and I said, look, I need to get together with you. How about if we go to dinner? So we went to dinner. And it was just kind of interesting. I watched him drink water. Have you ever watched somebody who needs their insulin drink water? I mean, he drank his water, asked the waitress for another glass, drank his water. He even asked me, could I have your water, you know? And, you know, finally there were 25 glasses all over the table, you know? And I decided I'd talk to him about this problem. And he said, no, I've been healed. His wife got violently mad at me and said, no, he's been healed too. You got enough faith. All right? I said, you're not healed. I am not a doctor, but look at all these glasses around you. And so, well, all I did over this was lose 2 people who at one time thought that I was their friend. And all they did is say, hey, look, we're getting out of here. You don't believe in supernatural. You don't believe in God. You don't believe in faith and whatever. And the only good thing that ever came out of the situation is that his mom started coming to the church and got saved and whatever. That was the good thing. Physical things happened to him. Blindness set in. I mean, I could tell you an ugly story. And I think in many respects, some of it, might be back to these physical effects, because he just went too long before all of a sudden, the doctor, pinned him down and said, you got to do it. But even his wife, you see, who was well, I mean, I just remember she just became violent, that I would believe something like this. All I'm trying to say is when people use faith in this manner, I think it is cruel. It is cruel. Can you have faith in God that He will heal? Well, yes. Yes. But I'm not sure He's going to heal everybody. You see, there's my problem. You look through the New Testament. I mean, did Paul have his problems? It looked to me like his problems. I left Trophimus sick, he says. Hey, he was the great healer. It must have been God's will for not everybody to be healed. Can we believe that God does heal? Oh, yes. Let's not go to the other extreme on this. I believe God does heal. And I think we ought to believe God. But maybe we ought to pray something like this, Thy will be done. If this is according to your will. Let's face it, all of us will face the ultimate sickness unless the rapture comes. And that's death. All right? I know there's a church in Seattle that says, if you just believe, you can live to be 120 years of age. All right? And I say, hey, I'm not so sure about all this stuff. All right? So that's what I'd say about faith. Did you have something? Yeah.
What should you say to someone who says faith, because you were just saying about the second without the cancer who, given water, it was gone, and he came back, and yet.
I would say, I would trust, I think I'd start this way and say, I would trust God, that He is able. We know this. Remember, we discussed the sovereignty of God and God's all power. He is able to do all that He wills to do. So, I would say, I got a problem in my life. I believe God is able. He can do it. Okay? So in that sense, I can believe. But here's the thing. It kind of gets back to this. I only know with 100% absolute certainty. Here we go again. Have you ever heard this lecture before? I only believe with 100% absolute certainty what? What is said in the Bible. Okay? It says if I believe, I will be saved. I believe that. I have faith in that. 100% absolute certainty, no doubts. Okay? But I don't necessarily believe that I'm never going to be sick in my whole life. I've never been in the hospital in my life. Do I believe I will never be in the hospital? No. I don't have 100% absolute certainty. All right? It could happen today. But I do know this, God is able to keep me out of the hospital my whole lifetime. If He wills to do it. Is He capable? Yes. Is He powerful enough? Yes, I think so. Okay? So, I believe in God and so forth. If any of you lack wisdom, what does He say? Let him ask God and He will what? He will give it. Any of you lack a Mercedes? Let him ask a God and He will. You see, what I'm trying to say is I don't have that kind of certainty in asking for God about things that are not in the Word. So, in fact, if most of us would just believe what's in the Bible, we would have our hands full, instead of believing all this other stuff that may or may not, you see, be true. Having faith as a Christian is, again, having faith in facts. Facts of the Bible. It's not being gullible. All right? We live in a mindless age. Did you know that? It's part of our culture. Let me give you a quick rundown on all this. There was a time in our culture, in the history of Western civilization, when we believe this: there is a circle of truth. Well, I almost ended up in the hospital before the class was over. By the way, did Marty say he's going to get my easel back here? Huh? Pat? Were you the one who said that? I believed you. I had faith in you.
It wasn't me, it was somebody over there.
Oh, I had faith in somebody. Here is the circle of truth. Okay? But, you know what happened in the history of mankind? Somebody said there is. This is not the circle of truth, this New Testament Christianity. This is the circle of truth. And that became the circle of truth till somebody said, no, that's not the circle of truth. This is the circle of truth. No, I don't think that's the circle of truth. This is. No, this is. And finally we came to this conclusion. There is no circle of truth. That's kind of where we're at today. There is no circle of truth. So, how do you find meaning in life? You take a leap. You take a leap. We call it a leap of what? A leap of faith. All right? And I'll tell you, our whole culture is jumping into everything. Into the Eastern religions. Into... I don't know if you can believe it or not, but our modern theology is the same way here. All right? When I used to teach contemporary theology, I'd bring these guys up and we'd say, look, do you believe, you see, in Jesus Christ? Oh, yes. We have faith in Jesus Christ. Do you believe that he was physically, bodily resurrected from the dead? What's their answer? No, nobody in the 20th century believes in that kind of stuff. All right? Nobody believes it. Then, what are they believing? It's a leap. It doesn't rest on anything. It's about as silly as, and every morning I come over the Willamette River, it's about as silly as coming over that bridge, believing that there is a bridge, when in reality they haven't put one up yet. You see, that is ridiculous. That's exactly where our theology is today in our mainline churches. We have faith in Jesus that doesn't even exist. Okay? That is, it is not the Jesus of the Bible. If it's not the Jesus of the Bible, what is it? It's a Jesus of your imagination. And how do you get there? You get there by a leap. A leap of faith. Our whole culture is into that. All right? Nobody thinks today. This is the only mindless society we have ever had in the last 2,000 years. And we're there. And I think it influences our churches. So I think somehow it influences this. Well, I've got some verses, or some videos I think I want to show you in the next couple of days. I also want to look at some verses. Some of you might be saying, well, what about these verses? And so I want to go over some problem verses that we find in Scripture too. So,